Incredible. So heartfelt. Thank you. Wasn't that good? Yeah. I can see you've put time into that, and that in itself is a blessing to know that you set aside that time to prayerfully study and research. And you can all do that. You can all do that. It's beautiful. Right, well, as we collect the cups, what are you doing, Graham? You can bring the palm branches over if you want to. He's like, the moment the boys walked in with the palm branches, like, do you want them? I said, no. Yeah, that's just in front of me so I can walk over them. And you've got any cloaks while you're at it as well? So, a jacket. Oh, beautiful. Great. I don't even know what we're going to do with them, but I just thought, I'll go get some and we'll just use them. It was perfect. They're props. You right, mate? You're trying to get it right. Well, we are going to do a little bit differently this morning. This could work really well, or this could completely flop. I have some sermon prepared here, but on the way up here this morning, I felt a prompting, which remains to be seen whether it was from the Lord or not, depending on how well this goes. Well, I am on a good thing so far, because I walked in with 3 palm branches. I got these 3 this morning on the side of the road, and there's 2 fellas and a young fella out on the street when I went to get them, and I got the right size palm branches so that those that came to church later were welcomed by the waving of palms. So that was a good sign that God's in the house and he's doing something. So let's see how we go. I thought what we might do is we'll have a conversation. We'll have a bit of a discussion around Palm Sunday. So some of you might be here and you might have some sense of the tradition of Palm Sunday. Who's been raised in a more traditional church where Palm Sunday was a big thing? Yeah, a few of you. I think I've said this before, but my parents used to, make me go to church when I was a kid. But I played baseball in the summer months, and the summer season would finish. And ultimately, it was around the time of Easter when they'd say, right, son, it's time to go back to church again. And so my mum and dad would just drop me at church, and then they would leave and leave me there to do Sunday school. But I remember vividly on more than one occasion, my first show up at church was obviously Palm Sunday, because I have these like formative memories of people carrying branches and walking into church, and I had no idea what it was. I just joined the procession. I was probably only about 10 or 11 at the time, and my sister and my brother would be with me. They were younger than me. We just joined the procession and going to church, and so I grew up with some understanding of that. And so it is. Can we knock the volume off a little bit? It sounds like it's just a little bit loud. Thanks, Jake. I probably don't need that much volume, but I might need some volume. See how you go. Feel like I've got it. It's okay? All right. Great. I'm not used... I can do that, I suppose. That'll hold it down a bit lower. There we go. So, so I just thought, let's just have a conversation around all things Palm Sunday and do a bit of a podcast. If the audio works, who knows, we might even put this on our Bible Wait What podcast. But this is an opportunity to do what we do every week when I sit down with someone and have a discussion. Annalise, we're booking into time soon. We're going to do a couple of episodes with Annalise. It's underway as well. So we're going to just try and do a conversation. So we'll read the scripture out of Mark 11, and then I'm going to open the floor for some Q&A. And this is your chance to try and stump the pastor, all right? Try and throw the really curly questions that I don't know and haven't prepared, and see if you can trick the pastor. But let's have a conversation around all things Palm Sunday. What does it mean? What is the significance of this event? Why it happened? And Leonie's touched on some of that already. Ivana's touched on some of that already. So has Vicky as well. It's all flowing together on Palm Sunday. But let's see whether or not we can get a more holistic picture in our understanding of what is the purpose of this service of Palm Sunday. And the title today is Meek and Majestic, what Palm Sunday teaches us about humility. And that's, as we've already seen pulled out a couple of times, that's a big part of the message of what Jesus did on that very first Palm Sunday. So a little bit of background, then we'll read the passage. Just to give you give you a little bit of, I don't want to answer it too much, I just want to give you a bit of fill in the gaps a little bit. I'm assuming that maybe you don't know anything, and that's totally fine. Maybe you're just watching this, or you're here and you just don't really know anything and you want to check it out. Do you want me to try a different microphone? Okay, sure. Yeah, we can do that. So a little bit of background is that Jesus, as you would know, come Good Friday and the time of his death, it happens on which festival does it happen on? Well, that's what we call it. What was it in the time of Jesus? The Passover festival, yeah. So we call it Easter, but the Passover festival at the time. And that happened on the 14th month of Nisan. Not the car, the date in the calendar, okay? It happened on the 14th month of Nisan, or Nisan. And on the 10th day of the month, they would in preparation for Passover in Exodus 12, we read that they would, every family would have to select their lamb, their Passover lamb. You know, this isn't like they went down to Woolies and just grabbed a pre-packed lot of meat and they brought it in and they just cooked it for Passover. Every family had to pre-select a lamb and care for that lamb for 4 days. The children would care for the lamb for 4 days before they sacrificed the lamb for Passover. Sounds cruel, doesn't it? I couldn't do that either. I don't think I could do. We had a mouse outside our house, and Jill caught this mouse, and I couldn't crush this mouse's head. I just wanted it to die in the trap, and it was half dead, and I couldn't do it. I just couldn't bring myself. I don't know how I could do that, but there was obviously significance in that. But that's what was happening. The 10th day of Nisan would have been the date that Jesus presents himself as on Palm Sunday. Okay, so and what's happening is that it's the biggest feast of the year in Jerusalem. It's also a time of political unrest in Jerusalem because the Romans are in power at this time, and a lot of the Jews don't like that very much. They don't like the fact that they're in their land and they're being oppressed by a regime from the other side of the Mediterranean who is keeping them under the thumb, taxes them, etc., etc. And so there are little pockets of Judaism, zealots and so on, that are basically like freedom fighters wanting to fight against the Romans. Probably in some, not that different in some ways to what Hamas would say they are doing. You know, very, quite similar. You've got to think the zealots were like that. They were like terrorists. They would do raids and so on. And so it's a hotbed for tourism. It's not a hotbed for tourism at the moment. It's a hotbed for terrorism at the moment, not tourism. Although on the real Palm Sunday, it was actually a hotbed for tourism and terrorism. That was the point. They were both there at the same time, okay? They were travelling. What's that? Yeah, exactly. That was a Freudian slip, that one. A hotbed for terrorism. And so they would come up to Jerusalem, and the crowds would come. Like the city would swell in population. People would be coming from 200 kilometres away in the Galilee region. They would come down for the Passover festival. And so much so that Pontius Pilate, who had been tasked with the job of keeping peace, just so you know, when you got tasked with the job of going to Jerusalem on behalf of the Roman Empire, it wasn't number one on the job list. It wasn't regarded as a promotion. It was the least place you'd want to go because it had a history of this insurrection and not aligning themselves with Rome. They become such a thorn in Rome's side that they basically just try to keep the peace. And so Pilate would normally be down by the beach, but he went up to Jerusalem for Passover because he wanted to make sure he was there to push down any risk of unrest. So that's all the background that's happening at this festival at the time that Jesus does what he does. So let's read some scriptures and then you can ask some questions. So we're going to read from Mark chapter 11 because we're in the Gospel of Mark, so we'll pick that version. It's actually, this story is one of the, only a handful of stories of Jesus' ministry that are in all four Gospels. There's probably only the feeding of the 5,000 and maybe one other one, which escapes me at the moment, and then this, that's actually recorded in all four Gospels. As Jesus and his disciples approached Jerusalem, they came to the towns of Bethphage and Bethany on the Mount of Olives. Does anyone know who lived in Bethany? Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Yep, that's right. So this little town of Bethany is literally the top of the Mount of Olives, just over the hill. It's only a few kilometres away from Jerusalem, and Lazarus, Mary and Martha lived there. So they came to this town. What had happened just prior to this story? What had happened in that story? What happened to Lazarus in that story just prior to this happening? Lazarus had been raised from the dead. We read that, it's only recorded in John's Gospel. Lazarus had been raised back to life from the dead just outside Jerusalem. So can you imagine, and Jesus was a frequent attender at this town. He was well known in this town. How much more well known was he by the time that he had raised Lazarus? In fact, if you read John's Gospel, it tells us that he had, basically the whole town were following him. Word had gotten out that Lazarus had died and come back to life. So there's already a crowd gathering around hearing this. So when they came to Bethphage and Bethany, Jesus sent 2 of them on ahead and said, "Go over into the village over there," he told them, "and as soon as you enter it, you will see a young donkey tied there that no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'What are you doing?' just say, 'The Lord needs it and will return it soon.'" Strange story. Someone might want to ask about that. The 2 disciples left and found the colt standing in the street, tied outside the front door. And as they were untying it, some bystanders demanded, "What are you doing? Why untying that colt?" And they just told them what Jesus had told them to say, and they were permitted to take it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their garments over it, and he sat on it. Many in the crowd spread their garments on the road ahead of him, and others spread leafy branches that they cut from the fields, like I did this morning. I did actually. I got a saw and cut it. I did cut it with a saw. There's no way I was going to break these things. And they've got big spikes on them too. You can break the spike. Anyone have realised the spikes that are on the bottom of these things? They are sharp, so I had to cut those off first. So yeah, I cut it with a saw this morning. There's a spot beside the street. So many in the crowd spread their garments on the road ahead of him. Others spread leafy branches and they cut in the fields. Jesus was in the centre of the procession, and all the people around him were shouting, "Praise God, blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord, blessings on the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Praise God in the highest heavens." So Jesus came to Jerusalem and went into the temple. After looking around carefully at everything, he left because it was late in the afternoon. Then he returned to Bethany with the 12 disciples. What a bit of a letdown. Can you imagine the story? Okay, so he walks in, rides in, there's a massive procession, there's crowds, they're anticipating something. Jesus looks around and goes, "Right, let's go." And heads back out of town, back up the hill and back to Bethany again. So, I'm going to open the floor for some conversation. What stands out to you? What questions do you have that we could just talk about and share? So we're going to do more of a Bible study, less of a preaching thing, okay? So, yes, Carol. The donkey. Do you want to pop that on there? Ask it again.
So what jumped out for me is the donkey and his knowing,
discernment,
okay, that the donkey was going to be there,
yep,
and also that he was going to be allowed to have it.
Right.
He didn't bring it with him from where he came.
Yeah, he didn't bring the donkey with him. Okay. So that is a really good question that the scholars have tried to wrestle with for a long time. How much of this was just divine knowledge? How much of this did Jesus prepare in advance? Because that could have happened too. I mean, he's well known in this town, and I think the prevailing view probably is that Jesus probably to some degree may have prearranged this, because we know from other gospel accounts that he also prearranged a couple of days later an upper room ready for his Last Supper. So he's kind of booked the donkey, I guess you could say, in some way. But nonetheless, there's still this sense of there's got to be more going on in the story than this, because he sends 2 disciples to get it. And he doesn't tell them, because you would think he'd go, "Don't worry, guys, when you go in there, you're going to find a donkey, but I've already pre-booked it. So, I've booked it on booking.com. The donkey, I'm hiring the donkey for the day, and it's going to be going back afterwards." Or Donkey Kong.
Did he know he was already late and needed a fast donkey to get there, and it was already too late?
It might be too late. He's running late. I think there's definitely a lot going on in this story. Okay. One of the things that a royal king, a royal leader like Caesar or a royal king in ancient Near East could do, according to most ancient Near East laws and Mediterranean Empire laws, is they had the right. It's called. I wrote it down actually. It's called the right of angry. Angary, the right of angry. And that meant that they could second any animal for themselves for a day under the provision that they would return it. Okay, so that was already something they would do. Of course, the king, if they wanted the animal, they could keep it. But the principle was that they could second an animal for their purposes under the provision that they would return it. And that was a common practice at the time. So when it says, Jesus says, "Go over there and let them know the Lord needs it and he'll return it later." So that does fit the context. So these 2 strangers who clearly, the 2 disciples go in, and there's strangers there who don't appear to know anything. So even if the owner knows about it, the bystanders standing around outside, they don't know anything about it. But something about the way that the disciples said what Jesus told them to say, the Lord needs it. There's a spiritual authority. And it makes sense too if this is the town where he is, like, they are ready to make him king. He's just raised Lazarus from the dead. They are ready to make him king. They know the Lord's in town. Word would have gotten out. Jesus is around. The Lord needs it. Hey, take the donkey. Absolutely. So I think that's part of what's going on here. But I think there must have been either supernatural foreknowledge that the donkey was there, or he had some kind of prearranged thing. But we don't know for sure. But there's a bit of background going on. Jesus is setting up this whole thing. What we do need to realise is that Jesus is choosing this moment to orchestrate his presentation as king. Because how many times in the Gospels have we read earlier on when Jesus would do some kind of miracle and they would want to make him king? And he'd say, not now, don't tell anybody. Or he'd disappear from the crowd and run away. So he has chosen this moment to do exactly what he's been deliberately avoiding for the better part of 3 years prior to that. Yes, pop it on the microphone.
Tell me, Pastor, why a donkey and not a horse?
Why a donkey and not a horse?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there a symbol there?
You can answer that, Vicky.
No, I can add to it. Why a young colt?
A young colt.
If it was a young horse, he would have had to ride the but why a young donkey that no one
Has ever ridden? Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, I've got a feeling when Jeannie asked me on the podcast, I couldn't remember the answer myself either. When she asked me, I said, I should have studied that one. And I think I might have said, yeah, maybe I need to study that for Palm Sunday, but I don't think I have, actually.
But the donkey is fresh,
Yes, it's...
he is coming
Yeah.
to...
I get that. That's definitely the case. And also, this donkey has never been ridden, which means it's not bridled. And so Jeannie made a point from memory in the podcast, which will be out tomorrow morning. It's a day late for this. We should have launched it today, shouldn't we? But it'll be out tomorrow morning, where I think she said, and I think it's a great point, is that the fact that Jesus is riding an untamed beast is actually going all the way back to the Garden of Eden story. That there's power over nature. There's power, which is what you're saying, that there's a sense in which he's showing his authority over, just like he'd done with the wind and the waves, he's now showing his authority over the beasts. Okay, so there is definitely, the mark is Jesus is doing something significant to show and present himself as king. Now, why a donkey and not a horse? So, I'm going to open the floor to that one. Who'd like to have a go? Because this is like, that's probably the elementary question, that one. Why a donkey and not a horse? What do you think was going on?
I think everyone was expecting him to ride in a horse, as in like a chariot, a king, a warrior, whereas a donkey is a humble animal. And that's what he was showing, that he's not coming the way they expect.
Exactly right. Yeah, go ahead.
It also connects back to when Mary rode the donkey into Bethlehem when he was born. It's the same kind of thing, like no one expected him to be born to a virgin in the stable, and it's the exact same thing. He's starting the way he's ending the way he started on the donkey.
Great. Just one thing to have a look at. Without disrupting, someone just see whether Mary rode a donkey. It's just, I didn't, because the point is exactly true. The humility point. You think she did? Okay, you can have a look at that. Well, okay, we'll come back to that, but just park that one for a minute. But let me show you a little bit more about this donkey. Okay, now you're all looking, aren't you? Leonie's looking. I shouldn't have said anything. Should have saved that one to the end. I should have saved that one to the end, shouldn't I? Luke chapter 2, is it? Luke chapter 1. It's a donkey on the chosen, is it? Okay. The humility thing. He has completely upended what they are expecting. Yes. So what Leonie said is true, that a military ruler who is riding into battle at the head of their army would ride on a stallion. In fact, you would be looking for the most powerful, dominating stallion that you could find to send a message, surrounded by your armies around about you as you head into battle. And that's the picture they have, that Jesus is going to come in and overthrow the Romans. Okay, that's what they're expecting, 100%, that will happen. And they would expect him to do that on a stallion. Now, he doesn't do... What are you looking at? What's it say?
It said Mary did not ride to Bethlehem on a donkey. Nowhere in the gospel
There you go.
does it say that Mary did anything but walk.
There you go. You mean my little donkey? We did it for a Christmas carol. We did it for a Christmas carol. But that doesn't stop the donkey analogy, okay? Don't worry, you're not... Look, you've fooled everyone in the room too, so...
It says the donkey was in the stable.
The donkey was in the stable, yes. There was a donkey, because there was still a donkey. Hey, this is Easter, not Christmas. Vicky. It's a long trip as pregnant. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's a long walk. It doesn't say she didn't ride a donkey. It doesn't say she. It just said, it doesn't say she didn't. It just doesn't say she did. Okay. Yeah. So it might have been a traditional thing. Anyway, let's skip Christmas and go back to Easter. So as mind you, riding on the back of a donkey when you're 8.5 months pregnant doesn't sound real appealing either. I wouldn't think. So as we going in this message of humility, here's what Jesus is doing. He doesn't mention it in Mark's gospel because Mark's gospel is a bit shorter, but Jesus is directly intentionally fulfilling 2 Old Testament prophecies. Now, I think it's Matthew's gospel tells us about one of them, and the one that Matthew's gospel tells us about is Zechariah. Zechariah, an Old Testament prophet at the time of the exile, the time of the return after the exile, so about 450 BC, something like that. Zechariah is prophesying at a time when the people of Israel have come back out of Babylon and they're just coming back into the land. When they get back there, they were expecting to have freedom because that's what they thought they would get. They'd been in captivity for 70 years. They were expecting to get freedom. When they came back, they found that it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. It wasn't what they expected it to be. There was a period of time when the people that had been living in the land for 70 years were ruling over them. That's the whole story of Nehemiah and the guys that aren't very friendly towards Nehemiah and all that. So there's this unmet expectations that they have. And of course, the story will go on, and over the next several hundred years, they will, even though they'd come out of Babylonian power, they will come underneath Greek power, and they'll have a period of freedom for about 100 years from the Greeks, where they'll live, where they'll have their own nation, and then they'll come under ultimately the Roman Empire. So they have this period of freedom, of thinking they're going to have freedom and have slavery. And Zechariah prophesies about this. He says, "Rejoice, O people of Zion." Zion is Jerusalem. "Shout in triumph, O people of Jerusalem." Just said that. "Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, yet he is humble, riding on a donkey. I will remove the battle chariots from Israel and the war horses from Jerusalem, and I will destroy all the weapons used in battle, and your king will bring peace to the nations. His realm will stretch from the sea to sea, from the Euphrates River to the ends of the earth. Because of the covenant I made with you, sealed with blood, I will free your prisoners from death in a waterless dungeon. Come back to the place of safety, all you prisoners who still have hope. I promise you this very day that I will repay 2 blessings for each of your troubles." And this prophecy became known to be a prophecy about the Messiah. So when Jesus is riding a donkey, they're trying to figure this out. They're expecting a stallion. The crowds think Jesus is coming to overturn Rome and set us free. And yet at the same time, Jesus has deliberately chosen to ride on a donkey, which, make no mistake, they didn't miss the significance of this. They might have been confused by it, but they didn't miss it. Sure as heck, the religious elite, the leaders in Israel, in Jerusalem, they did not miss the point of what Jesus was doing. They knew what he was claiming. He was claiming to be Messiah. He was deliberately stating before them all, "I am the one that Zechariah was prophesying about." We haven't got time to look at the other one, although we did touch on it a couple of weeks ago when we did the power of blessings and cursings. Some 2 weeks ago when I preached here, and we talked about Jacob prophesying over his sons, and one of them he prophesies over is Judah in Genesis 49. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah until the one to whom it is supposed to come, the one who will rule the nations," talking about Jesus. And if you read the rest of that psalm, the rest of that prophecy that Jacob gave there, mentions donkeys. It actually mentions donkeys. So Jesus had that in his mind as well, that the king would rule on a donkey. Now, it wasn't totally unheard of for a ruling king to ride a donkey. But they would not ride a donkey into battle to overthrow an oppressive empire. Once they had defeated the empire, they would sometimes do this. The leaders of the empires would sometimes ride a mule, ride a donkey, ride a colt, ride a young animal as a sign of, it was basically political propaganda. It was, I come in peace. Forget the fact we've just annihilated your army and we're going to tax you heavily, but you don't need to be afraid of us, we come in peace. You know, that was, so Jesus was mixing and conflating those two together. Jesus was coming in peace before he had overthrown the enemy. In fact, Jesus was going to overthrow the enemy by coming in peace. By coming in peace. By coming humbly. All right? Who would like to ask something else? Front row's getting a lot of voices. Come up the back. Annie, go ahead.
Just in regard to back in the day. So back in the day, they're rejoicing. There's this king coming. So they didn't know he was going to be crucified. So today, on Palm Sunday, what are we supposed to be doing?
Great question. That's a really good question. Because we have the benefit of knowing the whole story, and they didn't. So as we think about Palm Sunday, we should be thinking about the message that Jesus was trying to communicate about his kingship and his humility. That should be the thing that I think throughout church history, that's the thing that has come, that's inaugurated Holy Week, is we remember this triumphal procession, but we do it from the perspective of how does what Jesus was illustrating what does it tell us about him, and what does it tell us about our relationship with him and the implications of how we should live our lives. So I've got some thoughts on that, but who would like to have a stab at what do you think? Someone else have to answer Annie's question. What does Palm Sunday mean for us today when we now understand what Jesus was doing? No? You're all deadly quiet? Thinking? Yeah, go ahead, Vicky. It's all right. It's good about it.
Palm Sunday was all about the king coming in and they're celebrating that. Well, we, this side of the story, know Jesus as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He is our King.
Yeah.
So we can celebrate on Palm Sunday his entry, but we could also celebrate his entry into our own hearts.
Yeah, beautiful. That's great.
Into our lives. He is our King. He's my everything.
We have to welcome him in.
Yeah, we've got to welcome him and acknowledge him and yield, because that's what you do to a king.
I love that.
You don't go up to a king and go, meh.
Yeah.
You yield.
Yeah.
You bow.
Yeah, and Jesus is making that. At times in the past in his ministry earlier, when he has tried to avoid the crowds, he's actually forcing them and us to make a decision. He either is king or he's not. You cannot, by the virtue of what he's doing, he's not leaving an option for us just to like him. Oh yeah, he's a nice guy. That's not an option anymore. He either is the king or he's not. And he'll come to us that way. He'll come to us and go, am I your king or not? Lord, I need you in my life. Great, but am I your king? Because true freedom is found in making him king. Making him the king of our world, which means we need to serve him. And he's role modeling this to us. So they were expecting a military ruler, and it's easy for us to sit in the 21st century, benefit of 2,000 years of church history, and go, yeah, well, we now know that he wasn't trying to defeat Rome. But I wonder how often we want him to defeat Rome in our own heart, when he's not interested in defeating the things that are coming against us as much as he's interested in defeating the sin that's the problem that causes it in the first place. So the word Hosanna, what does Hosanna mean? We sang it today. What does the word mean? Anyone know? No? No, that's hallelujah. Praise the Lord. Hallelujah.
I don't know the meaning, but to me, seeing it is, it's a joyful, victory is coming, that type of,
It comes with that, but let me tell you what it means. It means, Lord, save us now. Why are they singing, Lord, save us now? Because they think they're about to overthrow Rome. They've been under oppression. They need freedom. So they're saying, save us. For goodness sake, save us, Lord. That's why there's an excitement about it, because there's also a desperation attached. This is the day. This is the day. Rome's going to get kicked out. This is the day our king's going to be on the throne. And Jesus doesn't do that. because here's the problem. Jesus knows if he saves us from Rome, there's always going to be another empire. If he saves us from the things in our world that are uncomfortable, there's always going to be something else that's going to come up. Some other bad thing's going to happen. Some other oppression's going to happen. Michael W. Smith sang a song years ago, I think I mentioned it on the podcast, called Secret Ambition. I can't remember all the lyrics, but it's a famous one of Mike W. Smith's songs, and it talks about Jesus, and it says something like, nobody knew his secret ambition. Nobody knew his claim to fame. Jesus' secret ambition wasn't to become king of Israel only in the first century. Jesus' secret ambition was that all nations would come to him, that he would rule over all peoples, that he would defeat the biggest enemy, the biggest slave. So in answer to Annie's question, sin is what enslaves us, and the way for Jesus to defeat sin was not going to be done through a military victory over Rome, because someone else would have come along. Or he could have this is what would happen, he would have set the Jews free, and then the Jews would have turned into the oppressors themselves. Because that's human history. That's the problem with sin. And so Jesus had to defeat a bigger issue. He defeated sin by his death. So he is coming humbly. He's picking a fight with them. Basically, he's saying, here I am. The moment he rides in on that donkey, he is drawing a target on his back that says, take me out. And they think they're going to win by doing that, but Jesus, talk about orchestrating it, Jesus knows that that's actually what he's trying to do. He's trying to orchestrate it because he knows that in order to secure victory over sin, he's going to have to die. It's like we now know that. How does that apply to us? We need to realise that Jesus defeated sin in our lives. We've got time for one more, and then we're going to sing a song and we'll be closed. Yes, Amy, right behind you there, microphone coming.
So he came in riding the donkey, probably deflated the people a little bit because they were expecting him on a horse to come and save them.
Yep.
And then he goes in to the temple, looks around, and leaves, probably, deflating them a little bit more again, like, what's going on?
Yeah.
So what's with that?
Yeah. That's it. And I think that's the point, is that they had the wrong expectation, and somehow Jesus, how more can Jesus help them to see they've got the wrong expectation, other than to do exactly that and go, I am not going to launch a military coup right now. I'm going to do the exact opposite and walk out. Now, Mark's gospel tells us he walked out and came back the next day and does something very significant. I think it's Matthew's gospel says it happens the same day, but whether it happened the next day or the same day, it's very vivid in their mind. Do you know what Jesus did when he, after the triumphal entry? What's the first thing he does in the temple? He overturns the money table. He cleanses the temple. So they are expecting that he's going to cleanse the temple of Rome, and instead he cleanses the temple of themselves. He did that, well, yes, one version says Palm Sunday. Mark's gospel tells us it's the next day, but it's immediately following, right? So it's in that moment. So he's totally to use the word upending, he's upending their expectations. He's going, the problem is not Rome. The problem is your selfish, sinful nature. Because when they're in the temple, there's nothing wrong with buying and selling in the temple. That was normal practice. You didn't want to take, just like you didn't want Mary to walk from Nazareth to Bethlehem, you didn't want to take your lamb all the way from Nazareth to Bethlehem either. So they would take their money, they would get to the temple, they would trade their money for a lamb that they would offer as a sacrifice. The problem wasn't the buying and selling, it was the usury and the high interest rates and the high markups and all that the rich people in the temple were doing. Jesus says, how dare you turn my Father's house into a den of thieves? And so that's what he comes at. He's coming at the sin problem. He's not coming at Rome, he's coming at the sin problem. So yeah, it would have been deeply confusing to them.
I think also, what you're saying about Jesus just left. He didn't want to. I think he just didn't want to cause a ruckus and an uprising or a stirring. It's just like his way of saying, look, I'm not finished yet. It's got to be me dying on the cross.
Yes.
It's got to be my death.
Yes.
Causing a ruckus.
Yep.
And,
Yeah. That's right, because what would have happened in that moment, Steve, is that if Jesus the crowds were ready. There was going to be a riot. And there had been. It was commonplace. The guy Barabbas that's on the cross with him 4 days later has tried to start an insurrection in the city. Whether that was this Passover or the last one or whatever, but he had tried to do an insurrection. It was a common practice. So Jesus was careful enough that, you know, as they're coming down, that you've been there, as you're coming down the Mount of Olives, you're still a fair way out of Jerusalem, but they get into the crowds, and I think it's another version tells us that he healed the sick. He healed the deaf and the blind in that moment.
This thing about he gets attention
And then drops it away. And that's what he did this week. He did enough to present himself as king, and then he was going to show them a few days later. And as you're thinking about that this week, think about what that action teaches us. It teaches us things like this. I wrote some notes. Let me see if I can find them. They were expecting a military king bringing military victory, but it teaches us that the way up is the way down. It teaches us about humility. It teaches us about meekness. Meekness is not weakness. Humility is not weakness. In the Roman Empire, humility was seen as absolute weakness. You do not show any humility. That is weakness. Jesus is showing us it's actually the opposite. Meekness, that my pastor told me years ago, and I've never forgotten, he said the definition of meekness is having power under control. So meekness is I know who I am, and I am choosing to use this power for the benefit of others, not for the benefit of myself. That's true meekness. So Jesus has absolute power. Didn't you know? We're going to read about on Good Friday. Didn't you know I could call on a legion of angels? But I'm not, because that's not what it's for. It's not for me. I'm giving up myself. So a role model for us, and Jesus would call us, he'd say, hey, if you want to find your life, guess what? You're going to lose your life. Take up your cross. Follow me. So as we reflect into Holy Week, I think we can reflect on this action teaches us about humility. It should inspire us to think about how do we act. Are we power playing? Anytime we power play, we're just as bad as Rome. Are we power playing, or are we going to give up our rights for others? Love them, serve them with humility, because that's what Jesus is doing. He found a way to fulfill and claim to be king, and in the process of claiming to be king, show us what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's an upside down kingdom.